Hello guys, this is Brian. I'll be one of the panelists. Best of luck for the round and congratulations on making it to the under-16 semifinals.
Hi everyone, my name is Maya and I'll be paneling alongside for this round. All the best to the round. Thank you.
All right, just a few reminders before we start. Hi, sorry about that. Just a few reminders before we start. I will be timing your speeches, but I don't think I'll be able to put timestamps in chat. So please time your own speeches as well as the speeches of other speakers. Only ask POIs outside of protected time. Before you start your speeches, feel free to introduce yourselves with your names, POI preferences, and pronouns if you wish to. That being said, all right, I see that both teams have also put their speak on in chat. Thanks for that. With all that being said, I now invite the
Chanidu, are you here? So just one thing. I can show you the timer bot at the top right corner. There is a window called view. I think that's where the time will show, and there will be an alarm which will go off after 8 minutes.
Okay, excellent. If we can have that up, that would be great. Thanks a lot, Raihan. But nevertheless, I'd say recommend you have your own speeches.
Are we starting right now?
Sorry, Raihan, do you want to set the timer up or?
Yeah, I have the timer set up. It's a Zoom app. I downloaded it. When the speaker starts their speech, it will start.
All right, that's great. In that case, I think without further delay, I now invite the first proposition speaker.
Good afternoon. Am I visible and audible?
Yep, I can see and hear you.
Okay. I would prefer verbal POIs and my pronouns are he, him. A farmer in Laos right now is most probably unemployed in its low productivity agricultural sector. What is he going to experience in our world? Now, he can move to a country, perhaps Thailand, with a higher agricultural productivity. Then, first of all, this gives him higher wages. Second of all, it allows him to provide for his family and country back in Laos. Third of all, allows him to bring back expertise to develop its autonomous industries in Laos. And last of all, spur Laos' economic development as an economic laggard in ASEAN. Throughout history, ASEAN has undeniably been a key nodule of regional economic and trade systems. Its societies actually have also been culturally linked for the past few centuries, and free movement of labor in those centuries was actually very, very common. In this new world right now, our side's position is that we prefer more people, more labor to move around such that it creates the most economic development and the highest prosperity for ASEAN. Let's characterize what does free labor movement look like. It looks like no barriers in immigration. There's no barriers in getting job permits, of course, apart from the legalities and security considerations. So therefore, it means that perhaps a worker from Philippines is very easily able to buy a plane ticket and directly come over to countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, find employers, and start work immediately. Under this work permit, she can work for either a temporary amount of time or for an extended period of time, depending on specific regulations. And I also want to provide you the context in which ASEAN is in right now. ASEAN boasts closely interlinked supply chains, and that's precisely because of a trend of deglobalization around the world, where ASEAN specifically is looking towards integrating its local economies even more in order to prevent any sort of global supply chain shocks. It also shows that ASEAN has diverse economies with vastly different opportunity costs. It means that they actually can provide a lot of their own raw materials for themselves. So, recognizing all of our characterization, we'll move into our two substantives for today. First substantive on better allocation of human capital in diverse economies, and the second substantive on stronger economic development. Now, on the first substantive, I have 3 observations to give you. First of all, which is that there is an unequal labor allocation in ASEAN. For example, fast developing economies like Singapore have a shortage of labor, whereas laggards such as Burma and Timor-Leste have a comparably higher birth rate, higher youth population, and higher productive workforce. The second observation, many of these productive labor demographics are untapped. Why? Because there are large rural populations currently in countries like Laos that are inefficiently used in primary industries, heavily invested in agriculture, which is still very unproductive due to a lack of investment, due to a lack of expertise that's flowing into Laos currently. Third of all, human capital is unequally developed in all of these countries. So we see in Singapore, where in a very fast-growing economy, of course, the labor there are higher skilled, are involved in more high-tech industries. Whereas in countries like Laos, they're still in primary industries. So what does our policy do to combat these 3 observations? This policy removes the red tape of labor movement. What this means now are that labor markets are much more efficient. They are now, of course, directly influenced by market productivity, prices, wages, and the invisible hand of the market will work its magic. Let me give you the very clear outline of how this impact really looks like. First of all, labor is going to shift to much more advanced companies, advanced economies. For Singapore, it means that with a high growing amount of labor, it can reduce the fiscal cost on raising an aging population. This is very crucial for Singapore, as now with a growing aging population that's sure to outnumber our youth population and any day soon, it means that right now the government needs much more productive labor coming in to contribute to our economy instead of letting the fiscal cost of taking care of a silver population overburden our economic systems. That is to advanced economies. However, the most drastic impact is to the labor of poorer nations, and let's unpack this. In rural areas where agricultural productivity is still low, which is actually we observe quite a vast number of ASEAN countries, there is a great deal of unemployment. And this unemployed labor force can now be employed in far more productive industries in other countries. So it looks like, of course, I've given you the example in the start of my speech, farmers moving to different agricultural industries in other countries to boost productivity. Of course, we can also examine the impact on the poorer people in the cities, because now it's so much easier for companies to hire and move this labor around. They can be employed by much more credible MNCs who offer higher wages than any of their local economies and can now immigrate to neighboring countries to get better wages. So it directly cuts down the unproductivity and reduces the unemployment that's observed in these unproductive industries. In fact, if anything, is a big spur-on effect to encourage these people, local communities, to strive for better education standards and to make sure they are more competitive such that they can get better standards of living. And of course, regardless of the result, the biggest benefit is that their standard of living, their quality of life is sure to increase for the local communities. Now to my second substantive, which is stronger economic development in ASEAN. First, let's observe that there are opportunity costs in these diverse economies. For example, some dominate manufacturing, agriculture. In fact, Philippines has a huge surplus labor of medical nurses. And the second observation is that ASEAN is moving towards a stronger integration of supply chains, which means that labor is more likely to being shifted around. It means that trade links are going to be stronger, where raw materials from one country easily comes to another to supply its manufacturing or high-tech industries. What this directly means when you cut down red tape labor on all of these countries is that aspiring companies and businesses can utilize these growing trends and capitalize on the deregulation that this offers and allow them to expand their company operations even more. Let's now think someone running a regional healthcare company. It can tap on Philippines' labor, Singapore's logistics, and other countries' aspiring university graduates. This impact on lower countries is immense because, of course, they might say there's some sort of brain drain where the most talented leave their country. However, when the most talented leave their country for better opportunities, they often send back remittances. which can directly form a large part of a country's GDP, boost consumption and spending. Second of all, these talented people, they don't leave permanently. They come back to Laos and Burma to share their expertise in building businesses such that they can create their own autonomous industries that are much higher productivity than any of the agricultural industries that we observe now. This is the direct GDP and productivity growth that we deliver for the poorest nation states in the end, and also the highest standard of living for the rural communities. For all those reasons, propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech and now invite the opposition first speaker.
Can I get confirmation that I can be seen and heard?
Yep.
Okay. With that being said, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the bulk of side proposition's material here is that they contextualize this debate as having an unequal labor distribution between these developing countries and these fairly developed countries within the ASEAN organization. Now, we agree that countries like Laos should have talented migrant workers go towards developed nations, but we do think that this impact that they claim is inexclusive because migrant laborers can easily travel from one country to another, especially given that countries like Singapore share a land border with areas like Malaysia, and we don't see any mechanism from their side that proves otherwise. But we also believe that if Singapore is truly facing these labor shortages that they claim that they are, then Singapore is then likely to accept these migrants anyways, if the industries are truly facing such shortages. We don't see why this is going to be a huge burden for them to the extent that they need to open all borders in order to allow these migrant workers to go towards places like Singapore. Moving on to my framing, right? So firstly, onto our burden. We believe that in order to win this debate, as long as we can prove that the economic development of Asian countries is significant enough to not need to have the exclusive harms that is associated with such free migrant labor movement programs, then I think you can take this debate pretty easy. On a characterization, ASEAN is an organization in Southeast Asia that includes countries like Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, the Philippines, Laos, Malaysia, and Cambodia. As is evident from this list, we can split Asian countries into two categories. The first is wealthy developed nations like Singapore and Brunei, and the second is rapidly developing nations like Malaysia and Indonesia. We tell you that the context in which this motion is likely to occur is that these migrant laborers are likely going to move from less developed countries to more developed countries in order to earn economic gain as a result of higher wages and more economic prosperity. No. And that is the basis of our entire case. What is the status quo like? Firstly, we tell you that in the status quo, these Asian countries are already doing well off economically, as countries like Singapore and Brunei have already experienced a significant amount of development, whereas countries like Indonesia and Malaysia already have a huge pool of talented workers and is rich in natural resources that allows for economic development. So therefore, given this contextualization of this debate, proposition has the unique burden to therefore prove that despite all of this prosperity within Southeast Asia, why then should the marginal benefits you're going to get economically outweigh the harms that I'm going to later talk about in my speech? Moving on to my arguments. Firstly, onto brain drain and how this makes it far worse off for those developing countries. We tell you that oftentimes there are educational opportunities available in Asian countries, even in countries like Laos, which proposition side seems to be talking about for the majority of their case. And there's oftentimes going to be a very talented pool of people out of these students. We tell you that the main motivation for these people to gain knowledge and work hard in these capitalistic societies and in these developing nations is to feed themselves and their families, right? That makes them likely to go to developed countries which have higher minimum wage limits and offer more job stability with their economic prosperity under their side when you have this lack of labor regulations when it comes to movement. No. Why is this the case? We see this happening when you actually see this motion materializing in other parts of the world. For example, in the European Union, when you had the Schengen area, you saw migrant labor from places in Eastern Europe, such as Bulgaria and Albania, going towards places in Western Europe with far more economic stability, like Greece and the United Kingdom, because they offered far more economic opportunities. So that left these places in Eastern Europe with stagnating opportunities eventually. But we also tell you that the unique harms of the brain drain is that these countries which spend tons of resources on their education are going to end up letting these resources go to waste because these people go towards other countries to study and work there, developing their economies and their research and development. And they later tell you, they sort of preempt this argument. They later tell you that these people are going to come back to their countries to develop industries that are far more prosperous than the agricultural industries, we don't see any mechanisms there, and we like to tell you that this is factually untrue because you're still far more likely to have more stability, earning money within these jobs in these developed countries as opposed to going to be entrepreneurs in these while returning back to your developing countries. And we also believe that the economic stability offered to you by these prospering economies in developed countries is an incentive for you to stay there in and of itself. So proposition might then come and say, oh, it's still good because they're still providing money for their families. Sure, but that means that these families are dependent upon these people and the economies of the countries that they're living in. We'll tell you later that there's going to be likely harms on these migrant workers, proving why it's unsustainable for these families to rely on these migrant workers in the first place. But even then, we think it is intuitive to say that it is unsustainable to have the people of your country be reliant on another country and
Point of
thereby have no
information.
incentive to actively contribute to our economy through means such as running small businesses. Yes, I'll take that point.
How exactly is dependence mutually exclusive to our side when, for example, many nations do have mainly bilateral agreements or trade relations with the nations they're already trading with? How is this any different on your side?
We believe that dependence is far more stressed on your side when you have a lack of labor regulation, when you have these movements that simply have no constraints, when laborers can just go in and out of developed and developing countries. That's the point where families start to become a lot more dependent on these migrant workers who are sending this money back home. We told you this should be fairly obvious towards you, panel. But these Asian states are currently facing a huge amount of corruption and human trafficking in and of itself. So it's likely that these migrant workers are also going to face a lot of problems when they're actually trying to migrate towards these developed countries. We believe that these migrant workers are therefore going to be in a state of exclusive precarity on their side because so far in the status quo, we're able to at least somewhat regulate it to an extent because there's far less movement on our side in general when you do have these restrictions on labor and you have these restrictions on movement. But on the comparative, when you have a huge influx of migrant laborers into these developed countries, it's very hard to actually regulate such movement and ensure the security of these people. So we believe that on their side, migrant laborers are at a far higher risk of being harmed by human trafficking. I'll go even one step further and tell you that these governments in Asian countries are fairly corrupt because the government officials at lower levels tend to not earn higher wages and can get easily corrupted by people who engage in illegal activities, such as those revolving around human trafficking, who tend to earn a lot of profit in these ways. But this just demonstrates how insanely difficult it could be to regulate this human trafficking that these migrant laborers are likely to get into, especially if even the non-corrupt officials don't have the capacity to regulate it, because there's a huge influx of migrant laborers once you remove all of these constraints, and there's all of this incentive to go towards these developed countries because of all of the economic stability and all of the wage incentives that they offer. So, I think that in the first half of this debate, in the first two speakers, the main point that we bring up is who's going to actually benefit more? In which side are the migrant workers going to actually benefit more? We tell you that when you have a huge disproportionate amount of supply and demand, where the supply of migrant laborers is far higher than the demand due to the wage incentive, these people are likely to face far more employer abuse on their side of the house. And as already stated, we believe that these migrant laborers are also subject to a lot of human trafficking and a lot of corruption and instability that's already occurring within these Asian countries. Not just in these developed countries, but also on their way towards these developed countries. We also believe that these migrant laborers are also going to be suffering within these developed countries in and of themselves. Why is this the case? Because when you have the huge influx of people into these countries, you're going to place a lot of social strain on the social services for these migrant laborers. What does this look like? This looks like when a tons of Eastern Europeans went towards the UK and crowded out the National Health Service to the point where they were unable to receive treatment, high quality treatment, and they had to wait long lines and long waiting times in order to actually get fair quality and even low quality medical treatment from healthcare services in the UK, and they were unable to receive language opportunities because such services were being crowded out by a huge influx of migrant workers. And for all these reasons, we believe that migrant workers are far better off on our side. Not just that, but economies are also far better off on our side. And we believe that proposition hasn't proven to you why all of these harms can outweigh the economic development that's already happening in the status quo. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thank that speaker for their speech, and now we're at the proposition second. Prop 2.
I'm sorry, am I audible?
Yeah.
All right. Please give me a moment. I'm settling some technical issues on my side. Hello, can I check if I'm clearly visible and audible?
Yep.
All right. Just give me a moment here. Right. As someone who personally lives a stone's throw away from the Singapore-Johor Causeway, the epitome of ASEAN coexistence, I assure you, without such free labor movement and etc., that our side promises, the thousands of workers within these two nation states or states alone would not be where they are. They would be unable to reap the benefits of a multitude of jobs available, which their side foolishly rebutted by saying, no, they will not be able to find jobs available otherwise in a multitude of jobs available otherwise inaccessible, among so many other benefits like salary differences that exist with our side proposed. Now, a couple of key responses and defenses to some of the claims that their side wrongly brought up. And I want to clash, of course, I will be clashing on this a bit more later on too, but I want to be mainly clashing on their point about brain drain, which seems to be a prevalent issue that their side keeps bringing up. To which we tell you that one, of course, one of their main responses to that was, of course, that brain drain will most certainly happen on our side because a lot of these workers do not have any incentive to return back to these original nations that they hail from. But of course, this is not necessarily true. And I will be building on this and prove why they do, in fact, have a vested interest to come back and help establish help establish their own enterprises that would obviously kickstart those local industries. Because of the simple fact that they are better able to utilize their expertise that they have, of course, garnered through their experiences in these currently more developed nations in ASEAN, such as Singapore and Malaysia. And that's a key issue I want to bring up, by the way. Now, obviously, to explain it very simply, these workers who obviously have increased expertise by working in these more developed nations, in more sophisticated industries, are incentivized to come back to their home nations and compete in these local industries they lived in and are familiar to because of the fact that these industries locally are obviously less competitive. That our first speaker obviously brought up, please engage, allowing for these enterprises or entrepreneurs who come back to kickstart economic growth and the expertise from elsewhere going back to developing countries also benefit from first mover advantage as well as a technological advantage over local competitors, allowing them to grow rapidly in developing countries and improve the economies of these LDCs, which is what both sides are supposed to intend to help, right? And of course, the whole point about dismissing remittances seems quite wrong, theoretically speaking, and of course, practically speaking, because of the fact that simply because migrants tend not to immigrate with the entire family if they're simply going overseas for work, which means that remittances are a given on our side, meaning they still have, of course, family members, friends, and etc., still living in these local economies, allowing for there to be remittances because, once again, they have a vested interest. I'll take your point.
the positive economic impact that these remittance brings is significantly less than if they just stay in their
I
local country.
understand your point, ma'am. Okay, now I want to bring up the fact that I've already told you about how if these workers stay, they aren't able to bring back the expertise they learned from more sophisticated industries. But two, the fact that you are undermining the importance of remittances seems quite concerning because of the fact that these remittances are literally kind of constituent as kind of, investments, because they would be collected as taxes or donations and whatnot that would of course in turn be used to developing the local industries by the governments, by giving grants and etc. Now I also want to bring up that I also want to reiterate that remittances are still better than the impact they would have had by staying, because they are literally not employed in their home countries. Which is something I will also bring up later on, because of the fact that this free labor movement that our side creates allows for basically one united big job market, meaning there's going to be so much more jobs accessible to workers, of course, to workers living in these LDCs or even DCs who are unable to find jobs locally, right? Allowing them to move all around and allowing more people to establish and secure a livelihood. Also want to bring up the point about corruption, right? This is exactly the reason why in a lot of developing countries, job opportunities are so limited and so bad, and their side visibly fails to engage on this, because we've already clearly elaborated to you the fact that, of course, our side is the only one that allows for a much more united and bigger and accessible job market with so many more jobs, because it's not just the job strength of or the number of occupations or job seats open of one country. It's about a multitude of countries, which is why there's obviously going to be so much more seats, or so much more job opportunities for people of varying skill levels and calibers and etc. And also because of the fact that this entrepreneurial aspect will also be increasing on our side. Now, I also want to bring up the fact that that migrants, about the whole claim about how migrants cannot find jobs, and this is untrue, because companies in richer regional hubs prefer the cheaper labor by hiring workers from developing countries rather than the more skilled but more expensive labor in regional hubs and developed countries like Singapore. Plus, migrants also have diverse and very unique skill sets, such as various blue-collar jobs that are, of course, being filled by migrants and are very important to any economy, and their pay is, of course, said to be going up, which means that it is a win-win for both the economy they work for and these workers. Now, I also want to bring up a single key rebuttal, right, which is the fact that these countries the whole claim about how these countries can still get labor without free movement of labor, and frankly, this is untrue, because poorer manpower cannot get. Because of poorer manpower, these people cannot get visas, right? They cannot have enough work permits to move. That, of course, our side negates the need for almost entirely, which is why it makes immigration into various job industries or economies much more accessible, meaning so many more people get employed. Now, I want to bring up my third substantive about how not only does this benefit local industries, but also benefit ASEAN as a whole, and this is the reason for which is, of course, the fact that our side attracts companies to regional hubs. Now, the context is that companies generally prefer, as they said, to enter countries like Singapore due to political stability, developed infrastructure, and etc. And typically, hence, the trade-off they make is that labor in these countries are much more expensive due to higher skilled workforces on average. However, now when setting up in countries like Singapore, they can hire from overseas to access cheaper and more diverse talent pools from our side much more easily. Now, the explanation is that companies have more reason to enter the ASEAN economy, because the other viable incentive for companies to enter ASEAN is because of how easy it would be for these companies to scale within the region because of reduced costs of bringing in labor from other nations and pushing out resources to, of course, other nations. And an example can literally be seen in the natural gas or natural resource or the energy industry in the EU, which, of course, allowed for countries like Russia initially to enter and hence, of course, supply energy to these nations, which we find mutually beneficial for both parties, both the foreign investment and parties, and of course ASEAN as a whole. These benefits are mutually exclusive to us. Propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and now invite up to.
Okay, let me grab the time. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Two goals that I aim to achieve in my speech. Firstly, we tell you why the focus that proposition has given is completely wrong in this debate about how the aim of this debate should be protecting the most vulnerable actors, which is developing states in this case. And secondly, I'm going to tell you, even if we ignore all that and take them at their best case and use their metric on how economically it's better or trading wise it's better, I'm going to flip that and tell you why it's actually a lot better on our side. Firstly, two pieces of rebuttals and a bit of defending our case and what the proposition has essentially ignored. Firstly, on their claim of brain drain doesn't happen, we think it's quite intuitive that this is just really ridiculous, right? Because empirically we have seen that brain drains just do happen. For example, in EU, where they allow free labor movement, there's a significant brain drain from disadvantages, for example, Eastern Europe countries, as my previous speaker has already told you. But secondly, even if you don't know that, we'll still give you structural reasons why there is brain drain happening. 3 points here. Firstly, because individuals are generally going for profit, especially these people who are lucky enough to be getting, for example, higher education, what they care about is profits. And therefore, secondly, the most profit they can get is to go abroad because the industries are more developed there, and they get a lot more higher salary because their economy there is better, and therefore able to provide better economy there. Thirdly, on how they tell you because their local industry is less competitive and therefore they would like to go back. Two responses to this. Firstly, this empirically is just not true. We see a lot of people, for example, in developing countries, go to more developed countries to go for jobs, for example, software engineering. They never really do go back to their country because their country's local industry is so poorly developed or it's very new that they would not want to take on the bulk to actually kickstart this industry because it's very tiring and sometimes it's not as high return. Moving on to the second point of this brain drain issue, we want to emphasize why brain drain is very, very important here, right? On two levels. Firstly, for developing countries, as we've already established, they're the most important actor here because they are economically more disadvantaged, and we think we should reach for the better trade and for the sake of the Asian countries. We think it's better that we try to have them more economically developed. And secondly, because they have the most population in these Asian countries, and we think that if we do not solve these issues, there is going to be a lot of, for example, people dying because the economy is so bad they literally do not have food, and therefore the brain drain only exacerbates these kind of problems. On economic development, worse for these developing countries, we think that with under their side of the world, their side of the house, the only people that actually benefit in these developing countries are the relatively rich people, that, for example, top 5% in these developing countries, but still ignore the people that are literally dying out of hunger in their country, and therefore it's very unhumanitarian. We'll tell you that this debate is just not just an economic debate, but you also have to engage with the fact that we should prioritize humanitarian issues first, as later I'll also bring back how they completely dropped an argument on human trafficking. Secondly, we tell you on the individual level, brain drain is bad because firstly, although they tell you that it's likely that they get high salary, for example, in other countries, it's still really, really bad for them because they will not be able to compete on the same level as the local people who are just born there. They get a lot of discrimination, and oftentimes they go there thinking they go to other countries having false hope that they are going to have a better life there, when in fact they just get discrimination and they do not get any actual support. And in the case of, and when they already moved there, it's oftentimes they are either stuck there by the attracted by the profit and unable to go back, or they are stuck there from, for example, contracts and very difficult to actually actually come back. And also there's thirdly, I would like to point out that the comparative here is, I think their side has essentially ignored how programs within these Asian countries already exist, right? The Asian countries do have an incentive to actually work together and benefit economically each other, and also to improve trade. And therefore, there are already programs. For example, if this industry does not exist in, for example, Vietnam, for example, Japan might make a program for the laborers to go there. But why is the delta here? Why is better under our side? Because there is a lot more regulation, as I'm going to tell you later on. Therefore, a lot of the power is held by these governments,
Point of
by these local
information.
governments. Sorry, later, by these governments and not by these multinational corporations. The difference between these two is that governments have an obligation to actually protect the people because their power comes solely and only from their people, whereas multinational corporations only care economically. They only care how much people they can extract from these laborers and not actually protect their labor rights. We think that is very bad, and under our side, with programs regulated by local governments, it's so much better. Second, our rebuttal of untapped
Point of information.
we tell you that this just does not exist. A lot of people are employed by, for example, factories in these developing countries. And B, we tell you that even if you don't believe that, Asian countries still on a lot extent help each other out by, for example, building factories in developing countries for their laborers. But we tell you that this is better on our side for 2 reasons. Firstly, it allows more sovereignty for these developing countries because the fact that the factory is in their country makes it more easy for them to protect these labor rights. And secondly, we tell you it's more efficient because it's more efficient for this country because they're able to, like, for example, leverage what they have in their country, their natural resources, and not just have these completely taken away by these multinational corporations which only care about their money.
Point of
And don't care
information,
about, for
ma'am.
example, sustainability and their country's sovereignty. Yeah, I'll take that.
How exactly does your side think a single LDC country will be able to counter corporate extraction or extractive behavior from these companies as compared to collective action of multiple nations on our side? That is a result of course, more united labor frameworks.
I think that POI is inherently quite confusing, right? Because under our side, it is more easy for these like local governments to actually govern the basic rights of these laborers and not have these multinational corporations. Because think about it, when these like restrictions of movements of labor do not exist at all, the multinational corporations are just able to use their profit incentives to trick people into going wherever they want without, for example, protecting their rights. On untapped labor stand, we tell you that under our side, untapped labor isn't actually such a big issue as they are already very employed, as you can see in the status quo. And even if you talk about, for example, blue-collar jobs that they're able to get in other countries, a lot of times they're unprotected from labor exploitation. And like multinational corporations are largely going to take advantage on that, which moves us to our extension on our argument on how multinational corporations have way too much power, as we've already established that only care about profit and incentives. And we tell you that the people that are only going to benefit by under these multinational corporations that actually get, for example, labor rights protected are the people who are already rich already, and the people who are poor, for example, like the 90% of the population in developing countries who are literally like having problems eating 3 meals a day, the multinational corporations do not care about these people as much as their local governments do, because this does not make sense for them, right? And industrialized wise, we tell you that when these multinational corporations can just like get labor from all over the place and put them in one place in one location that they like, the industry is going to be very, very monopolized. And we think that is very bad because A, you lack competition, so therefore the prices are going to be jacked up really high, and B, it's bad for these developing countries to actually go into these games, and therefore under their side of the world, these developing countries are going to just like be poor and have humanitarian issues for eternity. Thirdly, we tell you that the human trafficking issue has been undealt with by side proposition on how there's that regulation, and therefore a lot more human trafficking because these bad actors can do whatever they want. Therefore, very proud to oppose.
Thank that speaker for their speech, and now invite properly.
Hi, sorry, can I check if I am clearly visible and audible?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, let me just set up my timer. Right. There are just two very simple questions I want to ask in today's debate. The biggest one by far being which side ensures greater economic development throughout the region. And this includes issues of brain drain on their side, which I will tackle. And secondly, which is a point from their side, broadly can be characterized as which side protects people more. So these are all the issues they brought up, for example, of crime, of human trafficking. Now, to the biggest issue in today's debate about economic development throughout the region. I mean, that's the whole point of trying to have the free trade agreements, or in this case, free movement of labor. Now, for one, I would just like to point something out right from the start. They claim that economic development is not exclusive because, and I basically quote, Singapore and Brunei are already developed, and countries like Malaysia have enough natural resources. Here, I think opposition seems to be living in a silo here, because the assumption is that development just happens, right? There's no explanation they seem to think they need to provide. Seems awfully convenient, don't you think? Because wonder why some ASEAN nations remain woefully underdeveloped, even compared to peers in the region after decades and after centuries. We have given you so many structural reasons down the bench. Many of them suffer from a lack of foreign investment, the initial huge injection of capital that's needed to kickstart economic development to employ more people, which in turn will consume in the domestic economy, kickstarting a virtuous cycle. We have told you how this is one of the reasons why, I'll take you very soon, this is one of the reasons why the job market in many of these countries remain so underutilized. You have a huge pool of unemployed, unskilled and skilled workers. But before I move on, I'll just take your point.
How exactly does your side solve the problem of developing nations not being able to develop, given that you're just basically giving a lot of power to these MNCs and not actually caring about the people dying of hunger?
So essentially, the POY is repeating what has been dealt with back and forth throughout the entire debate. And yes, I'll tackle that right now. So we have already told you that we completely recognize that there's this inequality in development right now, that we suffer from that many of these poorer countries suffer from an underutilized job market. And we don't deny the fact that now you're going to have brain drain. We completely don't deny that. That's the whole point. We want people moving oftentimes from poorer countries to richer countries because of the better job opportunity, job prospect, because of the better standards of living over there. That's the entire point. And when we are talking about poorer countries here, our side is the side that does the best for them to develop. Why? Because we crucially provide the missing link, the capital that's needed that doesn't flow to these developing countries out of nowhere. All right? That you can't go forward with the assumption that development just happens, that somehow the cycle kickstarts on its own, that this capital is injected on its own out of nowhere. Because the fact is, there's no foreign investment in these countries for a reason. On our side, we recognize these facts. What we are doing here is to offer a solution. Yes, you are going to have brain drain. You are going to have a lot of your workforce moving to these richer countries. The point is, they earn remittances. Doesn't matter what their intention is. Doesn't even matter whether all of them move back to their home country, participate in the local industry or not. The key is the capital flows back to your developing countries. Because note, it's all the characteristic of this labor movement that already happens in ASEAN is it's not the whole family that moves. It's your young men and women, people of working age, maybe just out of school, that move to these richer countries in search of better job prospects. Their family stays back home, their parents, their grandparents, very young siblings, they send the bulk of their income home as remittances. We have given you so many examples of that. We've told you about Filipino nurses who come to countries like Singapore, participate in the local economy, sends literally 60, 70, 80% of the income back home. We can tell you that happens with take helpers and maids, for example, construction workers between Singapore and Malaysia, between Malaysia and Thailand. These are the facts of how the labor movement happens and how human capital and financial capital flows in ASEAN. And we are telling you that we are completing the missing link for the poorer countries, no thank you, to kickstart development or at least to develop their local industries. Now, I'll just say that even if I accept everything that they have talked about for this, the most important point in this debate, even if I recognize that there's a huge brain drain, there's a huge loss of talent, we say that we are willing to accept that. We are saying that it's far more important for this financial capital to flow back, and also for these people from poorer countries, as they gain more expertise, many of them move back to their home countries with their families, especially when they are able to take advantage of the local industries and economies, especially when they're able to take advantage of the comparably lower labor prices. Even if that doesn't happen, the majority of times, we are saying that on either scenario, outside wins, and that's the point. And now, to tackle the point on MNCs, do they exploit labor? And the truths that you are mentioning, they are already existing. However, it means that with free movement, people on our side can escape these MNCs. They can move to other countries, can find a better life. In fact, the key thing is, we think Western MNCs are not even the main point of the debate. It's your regional startups who are poised to grow, as it's your regional companies taking advantage of regional supply chains. On our side, where it's not true that MNCs are able to harm citizens more when opposition seems to be just villainizing them and characterizing them as completely evil. In fact, it is on our side where countries are incentivized to improve security standards, even if I accept everything they have talked about just now, even if I completely ignore all the layers of reasoning on this very point that my first two speakers have already given you. On our side, at least, one more extension to what my second speaker has already said is that at least throughout the region, countries are incentivized to protect their citizens at home and abroad. Countries are incentivized to set up stronger legal frameworks for workers, including foreign workers. It's not like on our side, because of free movement, you're going to have terrorists and human traffickers roaming around. The EU has complete free movement of labor. Doesn't mean terrorists are strutting in the streets. Or Paris, we are telling you that even if, again, I accept everything that they say, right? Even if I don't deny any of them, it's a separate issue entirely. Just because you have free movement of labor doesn't mean law enforcement agencies, for one, are suddenly disempowered from doing anything. Doesn't mean that human traffickers now aren't being arrested and being banned from traveling. That is a completely different issue from the free movement and deregulation of labor, right? Completely separate issues. And in fact, another layer is, at least on our side, with the free movement of labor, you have far less people stuck in their home countries in terrible economic conditions, in terrible working conditions, who are even more desperate, who see no way out, especially when their home industries and economies have essentially no light at the end of the tunnel. This is when you have people who are more desperate, who are more susceptible and vulnerable. And because of all these reasons, this motion must and will stand. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I'll let them think.
Okay, just to confirm that I'm both visible and audible.
Yep.
Okay. Before I start my speech, real quick, POI preferences verbally and pronouns he, him. So with that, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things I'm going to do in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to cover which side better benefits the countries of ASEAN in terms of economic development as a whole, which is what side opposition focuses on the entire debate. Secondly, I'll go on to which side better benefits the people and the individuals of ASEAN member nations. So firstly, onto which side better benefits the countries as a whole. What side proposition needed to prove to you was why this difference in labor necessarily is crucial for economic development. So what did they tell you? They told you that there's unemployment currently because there are large rural populations and there's a lack of foreign investment. We have that's rapidly changing through things like organic change already, right? We see that like Prop 1 himself characterized ASEAN countries as already somewhat dependent on each other because their natural resources that less economically developed nations possess, right? Like they tell you, ASEAN nations want to be more interconnected and less dependent on, for example, the Western world. So we see foreign investment probably happening to some degree on both sides of the house, right? And there's probably mildly some amounts of change, but I think that's probably very marginal on their side of the house, right? We think overall in recent years, there's an increasing trend where these ASEAN nations want to be more connected to these less economically developed nations. And again, that's why currently we see a huge spike in development for ASEAN nations. We see that's why currently there's actually change manifesting, right? But second thing, let's move on to the second clash, which is far more important, on which side better benefits the people of ASEAN members. And this includes things like brain drain, which also deals with that first clash, right? So I think the first major part of this clash here is whether things like brain drain are going to occur, or if these people are going to send remittances and also like become an entrepreneur in their home countries. So what have we told you on brain drain then? First of all, we've told you that these people go for profit. We've told you that overwhelmingly, the industries in these more economically developed countries are far better, far more developed, far more profitable, right? You're going to get things like higher wages, right? And additionally, we think these countries have things like higher purchasing powers. You're probably going to make a lot more money off of that. I think that this is something that side proposition doesn't really contest. And secondly, the crucial part of this debate is also that these people go for better social services, things like less crime that we've told you throughout our bench, right? Yeah, they go for better like things about retirement, better conditions. All of these things are other reasons why they go to these countries as in terms of welfare compared to just the idea of more profit. This is why we think they're likely to stay because of these things like welfare that they do not possibly dream of in their home countries. This is very important. I'm going to be touching on this more later on. So notice how this also responds to side proposition's idea of development generally, because although we might not get a significant amount of change, at least not changing is better than a significant decrease and causing a brain drain in the nation, right? Why have we told you this is so important? Because we told you with brain drain, what happens is then because you do not have any more like intelligent people in your nation, there's going to be a huge effect where you get things like the economy suffers. You get things like lack of social services. All of these impacts that our first speaker clearly structurally analyzed for you. So well, and let's deal with what side proposition pushes back. They have two pushes. Number one on remittances. Why are remittances bad for these original nations then? I think there's two layers of this. First layer, if the economy is suffering, then these remittances largely do not matter, right? And then when brain drain occurs, we tell you that the impacts of like, for example, the lack of social services. That means that remittances can't keep up with like things like inflation that occurs with a worse economy, right? We think that these families of these migrant workers are going to be far worse off because maybe they're earning a bit more money from like remittances, but they're also going to be, that money is also going to be worth a lot less with things like inflation. So they're still not going to be able to buy as much, right? But let's take this one step further. This is a crucial part of this debate then. We say that it disproportionately affects poorer members of the less developed country. Why? Because we say that those less wealthy people can only bring themselves, since this is only free movement of labor, right? And they're probably going to leave, for example, their child, their family, their parents behind, right? Comparatively, crucially, those that are able to afford it probably are just going to move to the more economically developed countries. Why? Because of the reasons I told you, we all told you before, right? I told you that they have better social services, better welfare, and better like they're probably going to be able to make more money there. So I'm going to contest Prof's idea that not everyone will move. And yeah, for rich people who are able to do it, who have the ability, everyone is going to move to these richer nations, right? So what does this leave? This leaves a largely brain drained country and vulnerable people left in that country with very little people who are capable of bringing money in the country left. We think that that's probably going to be the worst impact because that leaves an entire nation.
Point of information.
Condemned. I'll take that point later. So this is literally what GovWhip told you, right? They told you that people who are able can move out to developed countries to escape the MNCs, right? Yes, those are the affluent people, not those that are extremely vulnerable. It is extremely important. So next, let's give you another response to remittancy. Yeah, there's going to be complete dependency, independent of the first layer, right? We told you that remittances makes these families dependent on these remittances. We see that this makes them, like, for example, more lazy, right? They not necessarily lazy, but they rely on these remittances and don't participate as much in the economy because maybe they're unemployed, right? And they don't feel the need to find a job anymore because they support themselves based on these remittances. We've seen empirically in countries like in South America that remittances create dependency and did things like increase inflation and worsen the economy simply because there's this reliance, right? So we told you this response in first why remittances create dependency. But moreover, we told you that this creates potential for exploitation between countries, given that now your entire economy basically depends on the other country, right? The moment the other country stops this influx of cash, boom, your economy is gone. You're very screwed over because your entire economy now relies on those remittances. Side propositions actually never really dealt with this idea. But before I move on, I'll take a point.
So your alternative then is just for these workers to remain in already oppressive working situations and economies in these LDCs that you propose, but that, by the way, also lack the benefits and such as welfare that you have mentioned.
Yeah, so what I told you is that a little bit of change is far better than a lot of decrease in change, right? So if you, at least on our side, if you slowly grow and slowly develop, like we told you, because of this organic change, right? You're probably going to slowly be able to develop. And it's a lot better than you suddenly getting a hugely drained nation. So at least on our side, we don't make the situation worse. So now on
Point
the
of information.
no, thank you. Second idea, that they'll become an entrepreneur. So what they tell you is that you're able to utilize your expertise that you've garnered in less competitive areas. The reason why this falls flat is because we told you that the economy of the country is going to be far worse because of the brain drain, right? If the economy is struggling and the industries are essentially failing, why will these people risk going back when they're perfectly complacent, they're perfectly fine with these richer nations? Why will they risk facing worse social services? No, thank you. This over time, worse social services, and because people have low purchasing power, crucially, I told you earlier. So if these people have low purchasing power, you're probably not going to be able to make as much profit, right? This is round winning because even though Pop's arguments sound nice, these entrepreneurs aren't going to be able to make nearly as much profit, first of all, and second of all, not just them, but also their families won't be able to enjoy good social services and social welfare. Panel, this is extremely important because we told you that there are structural reasons why these entrepreneurs won't be able to make profit, and we deal with the second facet that proposition ignores about their family. That's why these entrepreneurs are not going to move back. That's why you get brain drain. That's why you get all of our impact. But finally, on human trafficking, we told you on corruption, how corruption structurally exists, and their only response was, oh, guys, the EU is fine. The EU is not comparable to ASEAN nations, right? Corruption occurs far worse on ASEAN nations. We think that there's also these issues of discrimination. For all of those reasons, we win on brain drain and we win on exploitation because those affect the most vulnerable people. Very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for the speech and now invite our reply.
Okay. Let me grab the timer. Sorry. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Two things I'm going to do in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to tell you on how prop stance is completely false and how throughout the debate we have repeatedly disproved that the advantage they claim to have. And secondly, I'm going to tell you why the status quo is sufficient and actually better for the most vulnerable factors as well as the economy under our side. Firstly, then, let's look at what prop has given us throughout the whole debate. They tell us two things. Firstly, capital flows back to the developing countries better on their side. They tell you by two ways. Firstly, by remittance from these people that go abroad and work there. 2 points that we have raised throughout the debate. This is a lot less significant the economic benefits that they give from these remittance, which is literally that only like hundreds or thousands of dollars sent back for their own family's need, is very less significant than if these people are more incentivized to stay in their own country and benefit their own economy. Therefore, we significantly outweigh their positive impacts. And B will tell you that even if you think the impacts are somewhat existing, we still say that this only benefit the more advantaged people in these developing countries. That is the people that actually have the ability to go abroad. The 90% of the population, which is like literally dying of hunger, is still uncared for on their side of the house. Secondly, they tell you that through foreign investment from other countries, they can get better for developing countries. Two points that is unclear. Firstly, they do not ever tell us why there is an incentive under their side of the house to actually invest in these developing countries, given that they can just move the labor from these developing countries to their own country for their own benefits. Secondly, we tell that under our side, we already have organizations like literally the motion suggests, the Asian organizations already have these very regulated and moderated programs where they can actually give investment without pulling all these people out of these developing countries, going to the developed countries and only benefiting the already well-off developed countries. Secondly, they tell us how they best leverage the existing labors. We tell you that, firstly, we think that economics, whether or not the economy of this developed country or MNC actually goes well, is not the most important point in this debate, as it is the life of these laborers that is the most important, whether they are protected and not getting exploited or not. But even then, three points I want to point out that we think we've observed in this debate. Firstly, they ignore the most urgent issues, which is for the developing countries to actually develop their economy right. Why is this important? Because there's only when the countries instead of these MNCs are the only people only actors who are incentivized to actually care for their people, care for their own economy, which benefits 90% of the dying population in their countries, right? So we say that it's only when these laborers are kept in their country that they can get development. And secondly, we tell you that who gets the benefits of maximization of these laborers? It's at MNCs, and they tell you that the MNCs will not exploit labor. We tell you that it's false. It's already happening, and without the regulation, it's just going to be, without regulation from Asian countries, with free movement of labor, it's just going to be so much worse. So we think it's quite intuitive that they are inherently exploitative, right? And secondly, we tell you that the benefits of these MNCs for these countries, as we've already established, for the most mobile actor here, which is the developing countries, there is no significant positive impact for them. What do you get on our side then? Firstly, we tell you that MNCs don't get to monopolize whatever industry they want. When they monopolize, it's bad for everybody, bad because there's no competition, but especially bad for these developing countries because they do not get an ability to actually grow the industries in their developing countries. And we tell you that investments have already established, is already possible in the status quo. Secondly, they've completely dropped our argument on human trafficking, on these malicious intents. That's going to be more easily executed and exploited when there is no regulation between these like, for example, regulated and kept track of by customs when under the status quo. When there's free movement of labor, the huge amount of people moving around, it's going to be very easy for these bad actors to exploit that and actually put people into very, very bad situations and get away with it. Thirdly, they have completely failed to prove their burden as proposition on why status quo is insufficient and they need to bear all the negative stuff we've already told you. Therefore, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now invite prompt reply.
He was trying to use the
Okay.
touchpad. I think.
Yeah. Am I visible and audible?
Yep.
Hello, very simple two reasons why we win. First, we told you why our economies will grow faster. Second, we gave more analysis as to why society as a whole will prosper more in our world. First question, why will our economies grow faster? What was opposition's push? Their main push was there was a brain drain of labor. First of all, we never said it doesn't happen. In fact, we said that we're happy that it does. Why? Because there's a weighing to be done. Either talent on your side gets wasted, and they continue locked up, existing under these extractive institutions. Or you risk getting some talent overseas, but some talent will of course get back because of various reasons of competitiveness or seizing market share. And when they come back, they're going to be the ones who are contributing the most, bringing in their foreign expertise back into the country and reforming the political and economic situations in this country. Now, the other push is that they also assert that development will happen without our policy. The third speaker has cleared up that by showing you how this free movement actually opens up much more valuable resources. So we clear this as well. Now, their final push was about MNCs, that we give more priority to MNCs. I would like to reiterate that our stance down the bench is that we prefer labor from unproductive sectors to move to more productive sectors. We are quite perplexed to why this was completely ignored and construed as MNCs. But okay, let's take them at their ground. MNCs, they talk about Western MNCs, which are completely unrelated to this debate. But then they talk about MNC exploitation, which, by the way, already happens in ASEAN countries, and nations already find themselves unable to do anything for protecting their citizens. But if they want to talk about exploitation, somehow our side does better. Because with the freedom of movement, now Thai workers say as suffering under the dire conditions of an MNC can now move to Malaysia to work for a much more benign company. Removing these structural barriers means that the most vulnerable, in this case the most vulnerable workers, have the agency to help themselves instead of being trapped in this. That's to economic success to prove this completely. Now, on to more analysis as to why society as a whole will prosper. Now, opposition's first push was that the government is corrupt and can't regulate well. On their side, with the entrenched bureaucracy, it first of all means that corruption will happen on a much larger scale without our deregulation of freedom of labor. In fact, with such bureaucratic barriers, this corruption is uniquely beneficial to the most malicious actors, such as regional criminals looking to smuggle drugs on their side. But on their side also, the poorest suffer, because nowhere under the current system the government allows the most illiterate and uneducated farmers to get a visa to go to other countries. These structural barriers act against them literally. We've also linked these structural barriers to human trafficking. Why? Because their lives are already in such a dire state of unemployment and lack of wages in unproductive sectors that they are willing to be smuggled out of the country that they at least get a marginally better life. In fact, linking that and my previous point, again, the most vulnerable people suffer in their work, the poorest who have the worst job prospects already, and that we have already characterized before why. Local economies and industries continue to be undeveloped due to the innate lack of initial capital and the high unemployment. They are the ones, the poor people are the ones who are most desperate, literally paying their life savings to smugglers who try to go on the highly precarious routes to escape this fear, to escape this sort of dire life. Now, the opposition also did a bit of fear-mongering on the strains to social services and security. We've also given you reasons why. First of all, because when labor is allocated more efficiently, countries naturally experience more economic growth, which allows them the resources to actually provide better care. And in fact, because so many of their citizens are overseas and working regionally, ASEAN now has more incentive to make sure that all the countries are actually safe for their citizens to work in. So in the end, social services across the board are going to improve. For these two reasons, propose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and all speakers for the debate. What I'm going to ask now is that the panel joins me in breakout room number 5 for deliberation, and we'll be back once we have a call. Thanks for the debate, everyone.
Thank you for the debate.
Thank you for the
Thank
debate.
you.